Hi everybody, welcome back to Collecting Canadian Cavalry and Armour. Today we're going to talk about the badges relating to the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion and a couple other little interesting badges that deal with the First World War Canadian tankers. Now, the British Army, once they realized that this tank thing was probably a pretty darn good idea, and they were fielding several tank battalions, they asked Canada to supply at least one tank battalion. So Canada did, and we raised the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion. They recruited mainly from McGill and Toronto universities for the 1st and 2nd companies. 3rd company was from other universities within Canada. They were very interested in getting well-educated people because to operate a tank, even today, you need to be a pretty switched-on type of person. I'm just saying. So back then, they rounded the guys up, sent them over to England where they started their training. The armistice on November 11th was signed before they could actually move to France. But they still had all of their badges and everything else. We're going to take a much closer look at those badges in this episode. So here we are looking at the other ranks, cap and collar badges. Yes, that's true that I have 2 right side collar badges. I will do my best to fix that in the future. Anyway, let's take a good look at the badge. This is a pickled brass example made by Hemsley. There were 2 manufacturers of these badges. One, Hemsley, did most of them, and Tiptaf from England did the badges as well, but they had more of a brown finish as opposed to the pickled brass. You'll notice that the striking is very crisp and clean, and on the back it also is nice and crisp and clean. There's no maker marks on the back of these badges. This is the other ranks cap and collar badges. So this is an example of the officer's cap and collar badges for the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion. The overlays on the tank and the Canada scroll are sterling silver on pickled brass. Again, these are made by Hemsley. Very well struck up reverse, and you can't really see how they've attached the sterling silver. That's an important part when you're looking for a real badge. It has to be crisp and clean with no maker marks. Okay, there are some counterfeits coming out of Britain. These are not the counterfeit. These are the real deal. So when you're looking for something, you want to find the officers' badges that look just like this. Now this badge is very interesting. So I would have picked this up a few years ago. This is, again, a Canadian 1st Tank Battalion badge, but it's got the fire gilt, usually reserved for very senior officers. I've never seen one like this before, and some people will say that it might be a sweetheart pin. I've never seen any of the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion sweetheart pins that look like the full badge. Is it possible? Absolutely. We take a look at the back. Again, it's fully struck up. There's no maker marks, but it has this pin, and that's why I believe a lot of people think it might be a sweetheart pin. Now, as you know, if you've been collecting for a while, or even if you haven't, there are many officers' badges that have this type of pin, both on the collars and on cap badges. So is this a senior officer's badge? I really don't know, but it's an authentic badge as far as I'm concerned, and again, 1st Canadian Tank Battalion, not a heck of a lot of information on their badges. So let's look at a couple of the other things, other badges that would be related to the Tank Battalion. Now this badge is very interesting. I don't believe it to be a 1st Canadian Tank Battalion. I believe it's a prototype or an example of a Canadian Tank Corps collar badge. You'll see the First World War tank on it. But when you turn it over, it's solid on the back, but it's got these lugs that are typical of collar badges as opposed to it being a sweetheart pin. Most sweetheart pins that you'll encounter will have just a pin on the back. We also have the British tanks shoulder title. Now, I have seen an example of a 1st Canadian Tank Battalion uniform with these on the epaulets. Wouldn't surprise me at all that was used as well on our Canadian uniforms. And again, on the back, there's no maker mark, but it does have the lugs, very typical of Canadian and British badges. We also have this British Tank Corps shoulder title. Again, it was British, but the Canadians used them as well. There is a cloth version of this. You'll see in the back, it's got the very British lugs on the back. Now, the reason that the guys started using the cloth is because these would catch on the hatches and on the different equipment inside the tank. So they went with the cloth badge instead. Now, we've got this, I've got this other collar badge here for the 2nd Canadian Tank Battalion. It's the left side collar. Again, pickled brass, no maker's marks, but it has the pin. Could this be a sweetheart pin for the guys that in the 2nd Tank Battalion as they were leaving to go over to Britain? Or is this an actual collar badge? I really don't know. But it'd be definitely worth doing some more research on. The Canadians did, and the British did use this type of pin on collar badges. So definitely worth looking into. Now, as far as I've ever known, there was only 2 2nd Canadian Tank Battalion cap badges. One is held in the collection of the Royal Military Institute in Toronto, and the other by a private collector out west who paid an enormous amount of money on eBay many years ago to acquire it. So here's a group shot of all of the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion, 2nd Battalion, Tank Corps stuff. These make a great display in your collection, and definitely worth looking at if you're interested in collecting original Canadian armored stuff. Several years ago, I was contacted by a fella who said that his grandfather had been a member of the 1st Canadian Tank Battalion, and he sent me these couple of wonderful pictures because they show exactly how the badges were being worn by our fellas. You definitely see the cap and collar badges. You see the very distinctive tank shoulder badge that was very coveted. Those were the guys loved being recognized as tankers. Here's one more shot of the fellow wearing them without his sister in there. But again, you see very good examples of how the uniform was worn on the 5-button tunic. By the time the guys in the tank battalion were formed, they got rid of the 7-button tunic that the Canadians used to use and went to the British pattern with the 5 buttons. So I hope everybody found this episode at least informative. These are excellent badges to add to your collection, and especially because it's from the early days of armored tank warfare. Fantastic stuff. I hope everybody is liking and subscribing to this channel. It would help us out, and happy collecting, everyone.